The last thing my uncle said to me before he changed the locks was, "Your father would have wanted this." I was 23 years old, standing on the porch of the house I'd grown up in, holding a garbage bag that had split at the bottom. My father's flannel jacket was dragging on the wet boards. It had rained that morning. It rained a lot that October in Sudbury. I didn't argue. I didn't have the words yet. I just picked up the jacket, tucked it under my arm, and walked to my truck. My father had died 11 days earlier. A cardiac event, the doctor called it. Sudden. No warning. He'd been at the shop, his machining shop on Lorne Street that he'd run for 22 years, and then he was gone. Just like that. I got the call at 6:40 in the morning, and I drove to the hospital with one shoe on. I don't know why I remember that, but I remember sitting in that plastic chair in the emergency waiting room, holding one shoe in my lap, thinking about how I hadn't called him back the week before. He'd left me a voicemail about Thanksgiving dinner. I never called back. I was the only one at the hospital that morning. That should have told me something. My uncle, my father's younger brother, showed up at the house 2 days after the funeral. He had a woman with him I'd never met, someone he introduced as his financial advisor, which I thought was strange for a Tuesday afternoon at a dead man's kitchen table. He said he was there to help sort through the estate. He said it very calmly, the way people say things when they've rehearsed them. The will reading happened at a lawyer's office on Elm Street downtown. I wore my father's jacket. I don't know why. Maybe I needed something of his close to me. The lawyer, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a very clean desk, read through the document in a flat, professional voice, and I kept waiting to hear my name. I kept waiting. The shop went to my uncle. The house went to my uncle. The savings account, the truck my father had just finished paying off, the investment portfolio he'd built quietly over 30 years of early mornings and skipped vacations. All of it to my uncle and held in trust under terms I couldn't quite follow because the blood was rushing too loud in my ears. There was a single line about me. A one-time payment, $1,200. I looked at the lawyer, and I looked at my uncle, and I said, "This isn't right." My uncle said, "I'm sorry, Evan." That was my name in that room, Evan. Not son, not nephew, not the kid your brother raised alone after his wife left when the boy was 4. Just Evan. The lawyer said there was nothing irregular about the document. It had been signed and witnessed 14 months ago. Everything was in order. I drove home, to what I still thought of as home, and I sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast my entire life, and I tried to understand what had just happened to me. The fluorescent light above the sink buzzed the way it always had. My father had been meaning to fix it for years. 8 days later, my uncle changed the locks. So there I was. Garbage bag, flannel jacket, truck with a quarter tank of gas, and $1,200 that felt like an insult wrapped in a check. I drove to my friend's apartment on Elm and slept on his couch for 2 weeks. I didn't sleep well. I kept running the numbers in my head. Not the money, but the time. 14 months. My father had changed his will 14 months ago. Why? I thought about that a lot. I thought about how he'd seemed distracted the last year, how he'd driven up to Manitoulin Island twice by himself and told me he was fishing, how he'd never been much of a fisherman. There was a voicemail I hadn't deleted. Not the Thanksgiving one, a different one, from August, about 2 months before he died. He'd called late on a Thursday night, and his voice was quieter than usual, like he was speaking from another room. He said, "I've been thinking about what I should have told you a long time ago. I want to take you up north next spring, show you something that's yours." He paused and then said, "Don't let anyone tell you your old man didn't plan ahead." Then he laughed a little and hung up. I'd thought it was just him being sentimental. He got like that sometimes, especially in the fall. I listened to it again from my friend's couch at 2 in the morning, and this time I heard it differently. "Something that's yours." I started going through things. I had a box of papers I'd grabbed when I left the house. Bills, cards, things from his desk drawer I'd swept into a folder without thinking. There were gas receipts in there. I found 3 of them from the same area. A Shell station in Espanola, one in Little Current, one on Highway 6 heading up toward the island's northwest shore. The dates spread across about 18 months. He hadn't just gone fishing twice. He'd been going regularly. I called my father's oldest friend, a man named Douglas, who'd known him since they were apprentices together at the same plant in the 80s. I asked Douglas if he knew anything about property up north. Douglas went quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your dad never talked about it directly. But once, maybe 3 years ago, he mentioned his own father had left something. A piece of land. He said he'd been trying to sort out the title on it for a long time. I asked why he'd never mentioned it to me. Douglas said, I think he wanted to be sure before he told you. You know how he was. He didn't say things until he was certain. That was my father exactly. He didn't say things until he was certain. I pulled up the Ontario Property Registry online that night. I searched his full name. I searched variants of it. I found nothing in Sudbury County. But property on Manitoulin Island fell under a different municipal structure. I called the township office the next morning and asked about records under his name. The woman on the phone was patient with me. She put me on hold twice. When she came back, she said there was a notation, an old Crown land patent conversion from the early 90s, originally registered under my grandfather's name and transferred to my father in 2019. A parcel of just under 4 acres on the western end of the island, near the hamlet of Meldrum Bay. She asked if I wanted the civic address. I wrote it down on the back of a Shell receipt. It took me most of a tank of gas to get there. Highway 17 west from Sudbury, then south through Espanola, then the long, slow causeway onto the island and across it, past the farms and the limestone outcrops and the stretches of birch that my father must have driven through a dozen times without me knowing. The address led me down a dirt road that wasn't on Google Maps, just a track between spruce trees, rutted from freeze-thaw cycles, with grass grown tall in the middle. I drove slowly. My truck scraped once on a rock I didn't see until I was over it. The cabin sat in a small clearing about 200 meters from the shore of the North Channel. It was small, a single-story structure with wood siding that had gone gray, a covered porch running the length of the front, and a stone chimney that leaned slightly east. The roof had moss on the north side. One of the porch boards was rotted through, but the windows were intact. The door had a padlock on it, and the padlock was new. My father had put a new padlock on a door that nobody knew existed. I stood there for a moment in the quiet, just the wind off the water through the spruce trees. A raven somewhere behind the cabin. I thought, either this is exactly what I think it is, or I've driven 4 hours based on old gas receipts and wishful thinking. I went back to the truck and found a folded envelope tucked inside his jacket's inside pocket. I'd checked the jacket before. I thought I'd checked it carefully, but the pocket had a snap closure and I'd missed it. Inside the envelope was a small brass key and a note card in my father's handwriting. He wrote in all capital letters, always had. It said, "Ballon of the trunk. Under the floor panel. It's all there. I should have said this sooner. I love you, son." I had to sit down on the porch step for a minute. The lock opened on the first try. Inside was cold and smelled like cedar and old smoke and something mineral. The stone of the chimney, maybe. There was a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf with a few paperback novels, and a jar of instant coffee. A wool blanket folded on a cot, a set of fishing rods in the corner, and against the back wall, a cedar trunk with iron hardware, the kind that used to sit at the foot of beds in old farmhouses. It wasn't locked. My father hadn't locked it. Under a folded tarp and 2 coils of rope, there was a floor panel, a rectangle of plywood fitted flush into the boards, with a finger hole routed into one edge. I lifted it. Below was a space about the size of a large suitcase, lined with a sheet of foam insulation. Inside that space, a metal document box with a combination lock, a sealed freezer bag, and a smaller envelope, this one sealed with tape. The combination was my birthday, 6 digits. I tried it and the box opened. What was inside took me a long time to understand, not because it was complicated, because it was devastating. There were 3 categories of documents. The first was the real will. My father had drafted a second will in March of the year he died, with a different lawyer, a sole practitioner in Espanola named, according to the letterhead, T. Moreau. In this will, the shop, the house, and the majority of his assets were to be held in a trust for my benefit, with a trustee who was not my uncle. The will was signed, witnessed, and notarized. It was dated 7 months before the will that had been read in the Sudbury lawyer's office. The second category was correspondence. Emails printed on paper, with dates and sender addresses visible. My uncle had been in contact with the Sudbury lawyer for over a year before my father died. There were references in those emails to a document my father had supposedly signed during a period, my uncle's words, when his health was affecting his judgment. My father, as far as I knew, had never been unwell. His heart had been fine at his last checkup. He went to the gym 3 mornings a week, but the emails talked about it as though it were settled fact. The third category was the worst. It was a report from a private investigator my father had hired in the spring. He'd suspected something. He'd been watching. The report documented a series of transactions. Money moved from my father's business account to an account my uncle had access to, small enough amounts that they wouldn't immediately flag, consistent enough over 18 months that the total came to just over $40,000. My father had written in the margin, in his capital letters, "Not off first, never discussed." He'd also written, "Even needs to see all of this." I sat on the floor of that cabin for a long time. The raven was still calling outside. The light through the windows went orange and then pale, and then the cabin got dark, and I realized I hadn't moved in 2 hours. I sealed everything back into the metal box, and I put the box in the cab of my truck, behind the seat. Then I drove to the Meldrum Bay Inn, which was the nearest place with a phone signal, and I sat in the parking lot and called the lawyer, whose name was on the letterhead. T. Moreau, notary and barrister, Espanola. It was past 7 at night. I didn't expect an answer. She answered on the 3rd ring. When I explained who I was and what I'd found, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been waiting for someone to call me for a long time." She'd been the one who filed the second will with the provincial court after my father passed. It had been challenged immediately by my uncle's lawyer and contested on the grounds of a later document superseding it. She'd been trying to reach me, but had no current contact information. The Sudbury lawyer had handled everything quickly, and she hadn't had standing to intervene without my involvement. She said, "If you have what you're describing, this is a serious matter. Don't let that box out of your sight." I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my truck in the parking lot of the inn with the box behind me and the doors locked. And I watched the stars come out over the North Channel, and I thought about my father driving up here alone, putting these things together, hiding them in that trunk, trusting that I would find them, trusting that I would look. He'd known something was wrong. He'd tried to protect me the only way he knew how, quietly, methodically, without making a scene. That was so like him it hurt. The next 3 months were not clean or simple. I want to be honest about that. There were lawyers and delays and a lot of driving between Sudbury and Espanola and 2 appearances before an estate court judge. My uncle retained a firm from Toronto. He told people I was emotionally unstable, that I'd always been difficult, that my father and I had been estranged. My father's friends knew better. Douglas testified. 2 former employees of the shop testified. The private investigator's report was authenticated. The Sudbury lawyer, who had drafted what turned out to be a fraudulent will, whether knowingly or through negligence the court was asked to determine, lost his license to practice before the matter was concluded. That part I didn't expect. He cooperated once it became clear the documentation was unambiguous. My uncle did not cooperate. He maintained until the very end of the process that he had acted in accordance with my father's wishes. The court did not agree. The misappropriation of funds from the business account was referred to the RCMP. I was told to expect that process to take considerably longer, and it has, but it is ongoing. What the estate court ruled, after reviewing both wills and the supporting documentation, was that the second will, the real one, the one my father had written himself, in his own time, with a lawyer he'd sought out on his own, was valid and controlling. The contested document was set aside. I inherited the shop on Lorne Street. I inherited the house where I grew up. I inherited the land on Manitoulin Island and the cabin my grandfather had built sometime in the mid-60s, which my father had been quietly restoring on his weekends alone, one project at a time. The first thing I did was fix that fluorescent light above the kitchen sink. I don't know why that felt important. It just did. I stood on a step stool in my father's kitchen at 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning, and I replaced the ballast. And when the light came on clean and steady, I had to stand there for a minute with my hands on the counter. I kept the shop. It had 6 employees who'd worked there for years, and I wasn't going to dismantle something my father had spent his life building. I hired a manager, a woman who'd been the shop foreman for 8 years and who knew the operation better than I did, and I told her I wanted to learn it properly, from the ground up. She said that was the right approach. We're figuring it out together. I sold the house. Not immediately, not in anger. I thought about it for a long time. But the house felt too loud with memory, and I didn't want to live in a place where every room reminded me of what had almost been taken from me. I sold it in the spring to a young family who'd been renting in the city for years and couldn't quite believe they'd found something they could afford. The mother cried a little when we signed the papers. That felt right. I use the money from the sale to carry the cabin through the winters. I go up to Meldrum Bay whenever I can, on long weekends in the fall, once for 2 weeks in July when the light on the North Channel was the color of old copper. I fixed a porch board. I repointed the chimney. I found, on the shelf beside the paperback novels, a small leather notebook with my father's handwriting in it. Notes about the cabin, measurements, plans for a dock he'd been meaning to build. I'm building the dock this summer. I used to think my father was someone who kept things too close, who held back too much, who never said the difficult thing outright. Maybe that was true. But I understand now that he was also someone who prepared, who looked ahead, even when he couldn't say it plainly. He'd left me a trail, not a letter. He knew I'd look. He knew because he knew me. I found that voicemail in my saved messages the other day, clearing out old files on my phone. I listened to it again. Don't let anyone tell you your old man didn't plan ahead. He didn't. He really didn't. I still have his jacket. I wear it when I drive up to the island in October, when the birch are going gold, and the road through the trees looks like something from a painting. I roll the windows down even when it's cold. My father drove that same road, alone, thinking about a dock he was going to build someday. Thinking about telling me, waiting until he was certain. I think he was almost ready.